Have you ever wondered what happens when selfless devotion to your children turns into a heartbreaking reality? Meet Annie Ju, a 55-year-old woman who gave up everything for her son's family, only to face unimaginable disappointment. In this video, we dive deep into Annie's story of sacrifice, betrayal, and self-realization. Stay with us until the end to discover why her journey serves as a crucial lesson on balancing parental love with self-care, and why understanding these dynamics is essential for every family. You won't want to miss the powerful message that could change how you approach family support and your well-being. If you haven't yet subscribed, I highly recommend doing so and activating the notification bell to ensure you never miss a video. Your support means a lot to me as we continue to grow our community and reach more people with our content. If you enjoy the topic of this video, please leave a comment with a number 1. If it's not quite your cup of tea, drop a 0 in the comments. Your feedback is crucial in helping me create content that better serves you. Let's get started. Society often says that the elderly shouldn't bear the burden of helping raise their grandchildren or running their children's households. It's a sentiment echoed in conversations everywhere. They've done their part, let them enjoy their golden years. Yet despite this prevailing notion, countless retirees find themselves entangled in the responsibilities of their grown children's lives. With a mixture of love, duty, and perhaps an unspoken expectation, they step in, caring for grandchildren, managing household affairs, and in many cases, reaching into their retirement savings to support their children financially. While such actions stem from an unbreakable bond of parental love, sometimes this relentless commitment crosses into self-sacrifice. And there comes a point when it's vital to gently remind these devoted parents that they too deserve rest, peace, and a life of their own. Constantly giving, especially to ungrateful children, doesn't just wear down the body, it depletes the soul, leaving behind a bitter heartache that no amount of family ties can mend. Annie Ju knows this story all too well, as it mirrors her own life in more ways than she cares to admit. Now 55 years old, she can look back on her life and see how much of herself she's given away. Losing her husband when she was still relatively young marked the beginning of a journey she hadn't anticipated, a life of shouldering responsibility alone. Her husband's illness had been a long, drawn-out battle, and by the time he passed, it had drained every penny of the savings they had spent years working hard to accumulate. The relentless strain of medical bills and daily life had left them with nothing, save for the small solace that at least they hadn't fallen into debt. But even though the financial burden was heavy, it was nothing compared to the emotional toll of losing the man she had built her life with. In the aftermath of his passing, Annie was left to navigate the difficult terrain of single motherhood, with a 17-year-old son who still needed her and a mortgage that loomed over her like a shadow. If you are still watching this video and find these lessons useful, please comment number 1 below to let me know that you are still watching this video with me. During those years, Annie had to stretch her monthly salary to the absolute limit. Every dollar was carefully allocated, with a portion going to her son's tuition, another to household expenses, and the rest to the mortgage that stubbornly refused to go away. It was an exhausting cycle of work, worry, and sacrifice. Many people with good intentions tried to offer her advice during that time. They suggested that once her son turned 18, she should consider selling the house, a house that held so many memories, both good and bad. They told her to keep half of the money for herself, give the other half to her son, and then perhaps think about remarrying. You're still young, they would say. Don't spend the rest of your life alone, living as a widow. You deserve happiness too. They meant well, but for Annie, these suggestions felt like a distant echo of a life she couldn't quite envision. How could she think about selling the home she had shared with her husband, where every corner held a memory, every room a story? And as for remarrying, the idea seemed foreign, even frightening. Her life had become one of survival, not of dreams for the future. So instead, Annie focused all her energy on her son. She poured her heart into raising him, making sure that he had everything he needed, even if it meant going without herself. When she finally retired, after decades of hard work, she didn't think twice about stepping into a new role helping her son with his growing family. She became the backbone of their household, caring for her grandchild, managing the day-to-day chores, and even using her retirement funds to help with the family's expenses. Annie never complained, not once. For 4 long years, she worked tirelessly without a break, believing that this was her way of showing love, of earning respect and gratitude from her son and daughter-in-law. She thought that by giving so much of herself, she would be cherished, appreciated, and even honored. But life has a way of delivering harsh lessons, often when we least expect them. This past May Day holiday, Annie came across a social media post from her in-laws, an innocent enough occurrence, or so it seemed. But what she saw shattered her illusions and opened her eyes to a reality she hadn't wanted to see. The post made it painfully clear that the respect and gratitude she had so desperately hoped for simply weren't there. At that moment, Annie felt the weight of all the years she had spent giving, sacrificing, and hoping for something in return. She realized that her love and dedication had been taken for granted, and that the life she had been living wasn't sustainable, not for her heart, not for her body, and certainly not for her spirit. Without a second thought, Annie made a decision that would change her life. That very night, she quietly packed her bags and left her son's house. There were no grand speeches, no dramatic goodbyes, just a simple, resolute act of self-preservation. She walked out the door and into a new chapter of her life, one where she would finally focus on herself. As she reflected on her journey, Annie shared her story with a bittersweet smile. "I'm 55 years old now," she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of years of struggle and strength. "When my husband passed away from illness, I was just 44. We had worked so hard and saved every penny we could, but his illness took it all. In the end, all we had left was a small comfort that we didn't owe anyone anything. But life after his passing, it was hard. So hard. I had a 17-year-old son to take care of, a mortgage that seemed like it would never end, and every day was a challenge. There were so many moments when I didn't know how I was going to make it through. People kept telling me to sell the house, take half the money for myself, give the rest to my son, and maybe even think about remarrying. They thought it would make things easier for me, that it would help me move on from the life I had lost. But I just couldn't do it. That house, it held too much of my heart. And as for remarrying, well, that just wasn't something I could see for myself." Annie's story is a powerful reminder of the quiet sacrifices that so many parents make, often without recognition or thanks. It's a story of love, resilience, and the importance of knowing when to let go for the sake of your well-being, and for the possibility of finding peace in the years that remain. Annie's decision to leave her son's house wasn't just an act of physical departure, it was a reclaiming of her own life, a brave step toward a future where she could finally prioritize herself, after so many years of putting others first. At first, I entertained the idea of remarrying after a few years. I thought perhaps finding a reliable partner would help fill the void that had settled in my heart. But every time I watched my son studying so diligently or thought about the kindness and love my late husband had shown me, something inside me hesitated. No matter how I tried, I couldn't overcome that emotional barrier. It seemed easier to wait a little longer, to hold off just a few more years before considering opening my heart again. After all, by then, society wouldn't judge a widow for remarrying, and morally it would be acceptable. But time slipped by so quickly. 1 year turned into another, and before I knew it, those few years stretched into many. By the time my son was nearing his college graduation, the idea of remarrying had all but faded from my mind. It wasn't that I had entirely given up on the thought of finding love again, but the prospect of remarriage began to feel like a gamble with stakes too high and risks too daunting. I had seen others remarry and find true happiness, but I had also witnessed the bitter reality of second marriages that only brought more heartache. If you are still watching this video, and find these lessons useful, please comment number 2 below to let me know that you are still watching this video with me. Having already lived through one profound loss, I couldn't bear the thought of enduring another. I convinced myself that perhaps it was better to rely on my son for the rest of my life, to place all my hopes and trust in him. I believed that he would care for me, that he would treat me with the love and respect I had devoted to him all these years. In those long years when my son was still in school, he was everything I had hoped for: a devoted, filial son who made me proud. Though he couldn't support me financially at the time, his actions spoke volumes. He worked part-time jobs, saving up to buy me new clothes, small tokens of his love that warmed my heart. His frequent phone calls became the highlight of my days, filled with conversations where he asked about my health, shared his struggles, and reassured me that I was always on his mind. He made me feel cared for, cherished, and important. And even though he didn't have the means to contribute financially, the warmth of his words, his thoughtful gestures, and his consistent presence were the greatest gifts of filial piety I could have asked for. Looking back, I realized that placing all my hopes on my son wasn't just about my belief in him, it was also about my fear of facing another disappointment. The pain of losing my husband had left a scar so deep that I wasn't sure I could handle the possibility of another failed relationship. So I wrapped my heart in the comfort of my son's love, hoping it would be enough to see me through the rest of my days. However, after my son graduated and stepped into the working world, the warmth and affection that once characterized our relationship began to fade away. The daily conversations that had once filled my heart with joy became fewer and more distant, replaced instead by a growing sense of obligation and strain. My son had chosen to settle down in the provincial capital after graduation, joining a foreign enterprise and quickly finding a partner, a young woman from another town. Within just 2 short years of working, they were already discussing marriage. At that point in my life, I had just finished paying off the mortgage on our family home and had managed to put aside a modest amount of savings. I remember hoping that perhaps they could delay the wedding a bit, or at the very least keep it simple, a small, intimate affair that wouldn't demand too much financially. But today's youth, with their grand dreams and modern expectations, would hear nothing of it. For them, a wedding had to be a lavish, elegant affair, one that would reflect their success and the start of a prosperous future together. With little choice in the matter, I found myself unable to refuse the elaborate wedding that my son and daughter-in-law wanted. It wasn't just the ceremony itself that became a burden. My daughter-in-law's family came from a different province, and they had their expectations: a large dowry, which they initially set at an overwhelming 180,000 renminbi. After countless negotiations and emotional appeals, we managed to bring it down slightly to 158,000 renminbi. But that wasn't all. When all the wedding and banquet expenses were accounted for, the total cost came to an astronomical 260,000 renminbi. In one fell swoop, all the savings I had painstakingly accumulated over the years were wiped out. My hopes of enjoying a modest but comfortable retirement vanished along with them. Yet despite the financial strain, the wedding took place as planned. My son was happy, and for a brief moment I thought that perhaps the sacrifices had been worth it. But that fleeting hope was quickly replaced by more demands. My daughter-in-law, being from out of town, insisted on buying a house in the provincial capital, a place where they could build their life together. My son, now married, seemed to have forgotten about me altogether. He joined his wife in asking for help to make their dream of homeownership a reality. They didn't demand too much. They said just 250,000 renminbi for a down payment on the house. But at that time, I simply couldn't come up with that kind of money. My savings were gone, and I was still recovering financially from the wedding. I suggested that we work together to save up the needed funds so that we could all contribute and make it happen over time. But fate had other plans. Unexpectedly, my daughter-in-law became pregnant. With a baby on the way, they were even more determined to secure a good living environment before the child arrived. This urgency forced my hand, and I knew I had to find a way to help them. In a moment of desperation, I made the difficult decision to sell the small shop left to me by my parents-in-law, a humble 10-square-meter shop in our 4th-tier city. It wasn't worth much, and in my rush to sell it quickly, I accepted a price of just 170,000 renminbi. But even that wasn't enough. To cover the full amount needed for the down payment, I had to borrow an additional 88,000 renminbi from my siblings. With a heavy heart but a determination to see my son's dreams come true, I handed over the money and secured the house for them. For a brief moment, everything seemed to fall into place. I calculated that I could repay the 88,000 renminbi debt in under 2 years with careful budgeting and continued hard work. But as life often reminds us, plans are fragile things. Just when you think you have everything under control, unexpected changes sweep in and turn your world upside down. When my daughter-in-law was 7 months pregnant and preparing for the baby's arrival, she needed help at home. I was still working, so I couldn't be there as much as I wanted to. Instead, her parents, my in-laws, came to take care of her during those final months of pregnancy. And that was when things began to shift in a way I never could have anticipated. After the birth of my grandson the following year, I had just turned 50. Initially, I had planned to continue working for at least another 5 years, hoping to save a bit more money and regain some financial stability. But those plans were quickly derailed. My daughter-in-law expressed her desire for me to retire early and help take care of the baby. The suggestion took me by surprise. I wasn't ready to stop working. If you are still watching this video and find these lessons useful, please comment on number 3 below to let me know that you are still watching this video with me. I still owed money to my family, and without any savings to fall back on, retiring at 50 seemed far too premature. I tried to compromise by offering to pay my in-laws to continue helping with child care, thinking it would allow me to keep my job a little longer. But my daughter-in-law was firm in her stance. She reminded me that her mother had already taken care of her during her pregnancy, and now it was my turn. My son, too, sided with her, urging me to step into the role of caregiver. At that moment, I felt conflicted. I only had one son, and the thought of disappointing him weighed heavily on me. How could I refuse his request when he so clearly needed me? Reluctantly, I made the difficult decision to give up my opportunity to delay retirement. I set aside my plans and moved into my son's home, ready to take on the full responsibility of caring for my grandson. Initially, I harbored some resentment. It wasn't an easy decision, and the financial strain added to my worry. But when I saw my chubby, sweet-faced grandson, my heart softened. Taking care of him brought a sense of joy that I hadn't anticipated. And for a time, I convinced myself that living with my son's family was better than facing the loneliness of my hometown. The harmony of family life seemed to make up for the sacrifices I was making. However, it didn't take long for reality to set in. I quickly found myself slipping into the role of a full-time nanny. From dawn until dusk, I was on my feet, caring for my grandson, buying groceries, preparing meals, and managing all the household chores. My son and daughter-in-law became like absentee landlords, rarely lifting a finger to help. They would come home after work and expect everything to be done for them: dinner on the table, a tidy house, and their child well cared for. Meanwhile, I was left exhausted by the endless tasks that seemed to pile up every day. My grandson was still very young and unable to walk, which meant he needed constant attention and supervision. Housework had to be squeezed into the small windows of time when he napped, and even then, I was always on edge, worried that he would wake up and need me. As the days turned into months, the physical and emotional toll began to wear on me. Many of my old friends, seeing how I was struggling, urged me to take a step back. They advised me not to overwork myself and reminded me that working as a professional nanny would at least allow me to earn a decent wage, perhaps 1,000 or 2 a month, and still get some rest. They encouraged me to talk to my son and daughter-in-law about sharing the responsibility, suggesting that they could contribute more financially or give me time off so that I could recover my strength. But every time I tried to bring up the topic, I was met with resistance. My son and daughter-in-law seemed entirely disconnected from the day-to-day realities of running a household. They would come home from work, exhausted and stressed, complaining about how hard it was to make ends meet. They rarely acknowledged the effort it took to keep the household running smoothly, or the sacrifices I was making. And seeing them like this, I didn't have the heart to ask for time off or more support. I kept quiet, afraid that any demands on my part would only add to their burden, and so I continued, pushing myself to my limits. The first year was particularly challenging. I remember when my younger sister back in our hometown fell seriously ill and was hospitalized. Naturally, I wanted to go back and visit her, even if just for a few days. But when I told my son, he immediately objected. He said they didn't have the time or energy to manage the household and care for the child in my absence. Instead, he suggested that I simply send a red envelope to help with my sister's medical expenses, rather than traveling back to see her. That response stung. It was a moment when I realized how trapped I had become in this role, with no opportunity to step away, even for something as important as my sister's health. My old friends continued to advise me, though. They could see how worn down I was and suggested that I start saving whatever money I could. They told me that once my grandson was old enough to start kindergarten, I should return to my hometown and finally retire, reclaiming the life I had sacrificed for so many years. Their words offered some comfort, a glimmer of hope that one day I might be able to rest. But for now, that future felt distant and uncertain, overshadowed by the daily grind of caretaking and the unspoken obligations that kept me tethered to my son's household. I once had a plan, a dream really, of setting aside my retirement funds so that when the time came, I could finally rest and enjoy the years ahead. I wanted to build a little cushion for myself, something that would allow me to live comfortably without constantly worrying about money. But as life often does, reality threw up roadblocks that made this plan impossible to implement. In the first year of my retirement, I took on the financial burden of covering the household's food expenses, hoping to ease the weight on my son's shoulders as he and his wife adjusted to parenthood. I didn't mind it seemed a small price to pay to help my son, my only child, and to ensure my grandson was well cared for. Then, 3 years ago, the pandemic hit and everything changed. My son and daughter-in-law both faced job instability as work became sporadic and salaries were slashed. The pressure of their mortgage loomed large over them, and I could see the stress weighing them down. How could I stand by and watch them struggle when I had a small pension that could at least help soften the blow? My retirement pension was just over 4,000 renminbi a month, and I found myself splitting it in half, using one part for food expenses and the other to help my son make his mortgage payments. My son thanked me, saying that without my help, they would have missed those payments and risked losing their home. I felt a deep sense of relief knowing that I could do something, anything, to help my family stay afloat during such uncertain times. As the pandemic's grip loosened, things began to improve. My son and daughter-in-law returned to work, and their incomes slowly stabilized. Yet, despite this change, I continued contributing to their mortgage. It wasn't that I didn't want to reclaim my money, but once I had handed over my salary card to my son, it became difficult to ask for it back. I thought to myself, what's the harm? After all, I still had some small savings tucked away for emergencies, and I had learned to be frugal with my daily expenses. I convinced myself that my son needed the money more than I did, and so I let it go. I told myself that my pension was there to support my family, my son, and my grandson, and that if I had already given it, then so be it. My heart was full of selfless love, believing that my sacrifices were appreciated and would be reciprocated in small ways. But as time went on, it became clear that my selflessness and deep love were not as valued as I had hoped. This year, on International Women's Day, an old friend whom I hadn't seen in years reached out to me. She invited me on a trip, insisting that I come along, even offering to cover all my expenses. She just wanted me to join her and have a bit of fun, to take a break from the daily grind. By then, my grandson had already started kindergarten, so I thought maybe this was my chance to finally relax, to enjoy a brief escape from the constant demands of caregiving. It seemed like a perfect opportunity to recharge and reconnect with an old friend. But when I mentioned the trip to my son and daughter-in-law, hoping they would understand my need for a little time away, they quickly shut down the idea. They expressed concerns about my grandson's safety and how much they still needed my help around the house. Their refusal was so firm that I had no choice but to reluctantly give up the trip. What hurt the most, though, wasn't the refusal itself, it was the complete lack of gratitude. My son and daughter-in-law didn't acknowledge the sacrifices I had made or the fact that I had put their needs above my own for years. Instead, my daughter-in-law casually remarked that my life as a retiree was essentially just being a babysitter, and that I didn't need to concern myself with other activities or pursuits. If you are still watching this video and find these lessons useful, please comment number 4 below to let me know that you are still watching this video with me. Those words cut deep. After all the years of giving, of putting them first, hearing that my worth had been reduced to nothing more than a convenient babysitter felt like a slap in the face. I had given so much of myself, my time, my money, my love, and yet, when I asked for just a small moment to take care of myself, I was dismissed as if my desires didn't matter. That comment left a wound that would take much more than time to heal. So I decided to return to my hometown, seeking some peace and solitude. I never imagined that on the very day I left, my daughter-in-law would post something so hurtful on social media. In her post, she dismissed me as nothing more than a stay-at-home mother with nothing better to do than care for the child, complaining that I was so boring she had to take care of me instead. Reading those words felt like a dagger to my heart. I had spent years giving everything to this family, and yet I was being portrayed as a burden. That post made something inside me break. I realized that all my efforts, all my sacrifices had gone unnoticed and unappreciated. Without saying a word to my son or daughter-in-law, I quietly packed my bags that same day. I left a simple note for my son and walked out of their house, leaving behind the life I had tried so hard to build with them. On May 1st, I returned to my hometown, and since then I haven't seen my son or my grandchildren. The attachment I once felt has faded. I've come to terms with the fact that my selflessness was taken for granted, and now my heart feels empty, where there was once love and hope. Reflecting on my life, I can't help but think back to when my husband passed away. At that time, my in-laws were still alive, and we relied on them for help, but their assistance was minimal. They offered little beyond some basic support when I was in labor and a bit of money here and there. I remember feeling disappointed back then, wondering why they didn't do more for us. Now, standing in their shoes, I understand their reluctance. After exhausting all my retirement funds to support my son and his family, only to be met with ingratitude, I realized that they must have felt the same way. It's a bitter pill to swallow, but I've come to accept that my role in their lives has diminished. All I want now is to live out my remaining years in peace, focusing on myself for once. As I reflect on my experience, I can't help but think of the countless other elderly people who are in the same situation as I was, selflessly helping their children, thinking they are fulfilling their duty as parents and contributing to the well-being of their families. But too often, the reality is that they end up feeling like a burden, and sometimes even become the target of blame. I want to share this message with others who are retired or approaching retirement, and who have children depending on them when you retire. It's okay to be a little selfish. Make sure you prioritize your well-being and happiness first. Before giving everything, your money, your time, your energy to your children, ensure that you have secured a good life for yourself. Don't sacrifice your entire existence for them if it leaves you feeling unappreciated and worn out. If you ever find yourself in a situation where your efforts are taken for granted, don't feel obligated to keep sacrificing. It's important to live for yourself, to find your happiness, and to enjoy your retirement years. If your children can't understand that, then it's even more essential to stand firm and be independent. Don't let yourself be reduced to a caretaker or a source of financial support at the expense of your health and peace of mind. In the end, the most important thing as we age is to find our happiness and protect our health. We should never feel like we have to become martyrs for our children's sake. As we come to the end of this story, it's a powerful reminder of the silent sacrifices many parents make, often without recognition or gratitude. Annie Ju's journey shows us the importance of balancing love for our families with the need to care for ourselves. It raises critical questions. What have you learned from this story? What will you take away and apply in your own life? We would love to hear from you. Please share in the comments below one thing you've learned and plan to bring into practice. If you found this video meaningful, please leave your comment below. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel for more content like this. Your support means the world to us. Thank you for watching.